What you see here is a scene, a frame, and one of the only images from the film aptly called Blue, a movie which for its hour and 19-minute runtime, save for opening and end credits, consists of nothing but the color blue. Having been informed of this concept, it would be easy to dismiss this as pretentiousness. The kind of film made and enjoyed by self-absorbed art snobs who project far too much meaning and significance to what is a shoddy pile of rubbish. Some would even scoff at the idea of this being a film at all. But upon examining further both the context behind the film and its contents, what one finds is something rich with themes of both personal and political significance. A film which not only challenges what constitutes cinema, but also the status quo its director, Derek Jarman, was fighting against. A last testament from one of Britain's most underappreciated and experimental artists. And due to my adoration for not just Blue, but also much of Jarman's body of work, I would like to make this brief introduction to him. Of course, it would be difficult to encapsulate the entirety of his oeuvre, not just as director, but also painter, author, poet, diarist, and gardener, in a video that is not multiple hours. So, because the primary focus of my channel is filmmaking, I will dedicate this video to his directorial output, and only as a short primer for you to use as a jumping off point to the rest of his work. Please remember to like, subscribe, and ring the notification bell for more content like this. And without further ado, come join me and learn not just about Blue, but also Derek Jarman, the filmmaker who lost his sight. Derek Jarman was born in 1942 to an upper-middle-class background. As such, his parents could afford to send him to Hordle House Prep School, a harsh environment that put a great emphasis on religious and masculine values. Derek would have a hard time flourishing there, dropping to the bottom of the class. He would fare no better at a public school he transferred to, named Kenford, his description of his years there being the most unhappy of his life. The reasons for his misery were various, such as him being singled out for his more swarthy complexion compared to his majority white schoolmates, as well as incidents of sexual violence perpetrated by his peers. Though another reason was his sense of alienation due to being queer and the knowledge that it was unacceptable to those around him. In fact, although he became fully aware of his sexuality at around age 16, he had known since early on that his attraction to the same sex would not be accepted, and had been made cognizant of that at age 9 when he was caught cuddling with another boy at boarding school, something he did to alleviate his sense of isolation, for which he was not just scolded, but also whipped and publicly humiliated. Although terrible, Jarman's school years did endow him with rebellious traits and awaken his class consciousness, something which would come to the forefront in his artistic career, but it was also a time when he grew an interest in the arts, as he would use painting as a form of escapism. This interest would lead him to attending art school, where he would specialize in theater design. A career in theater followed, where he would design for plays and ballets. This led to work on film as well, a career path he landed on by accident, when by chance he invited a woman to sit with him on a train, not knowing that she was friends with the director Ken Russell. Thinking the two men would get along, she told Russell of the theater designer, and the director would ring Jarman up as he was in need for someone to design for his upcoming project The Devils, a historical drama set in the French city of Loudun. What Jarman would offer the project was a fresh way of depicting historical settings, eschewing the traditional aesthetic of crumbling and cracked cobblestone walls for stark white, minimalist structures that look unlike anything seen in most period films. A design principle that was filled with anachronism, but what the film lacked in historical accuracy, it made up with in style. The interiors of the convent, and especially the torture room, are given a cold, eerie feel by the white brick walls. The decadence of the French nobility is captured well by the opening scene. So the two were well matched, and Jarman was set for a career in film set design, receiving job offers from not just Russell, but also Stanley Kubrick, and even one as a stage designer for Alice Cooper. But around the same time, Jarman had started using a new tool for his artworks, a Super 8 camera, which he experimented with by making shorts, a new avenue for creation, which would lead to him making his own films. Jarman always preferred the Super 8 camera over any other, as it allotted him more creative freedom despite its technical limitations. It is a lightweight handheld piece of equipment that was much easier to load, unload and operate than cinema cameras, while being much cheaper as well. This allowed him to explore a more improvisational style of filmmaking, many of his shorts and even features having been made up on the spot with little planning, which was ideal for his intended style, as he saw many of his films as poetry of fire that put an emphasis on mood over narrative. And it does help to see many of Jarman's films as visual poems, like as an example one of his most experimental features, The Angelic Conversation, a collection of distorted Super 8 footage with bits of Shakespeare's poetry narrated by Judi Dench, which as a narrative is incomprehensible and impenetrable, but as an ambient experience works much better. That said, this style of his took a while to get right, as many of his early shorts and Angelic Conversation can be a difficult watch, due mostly to the monotony of images, some shots in Angelic Conversation lasting far too long, made worse by the slowed frame rate. The overall experience made even more challenging by the lack of a narrative through-line to grasp onto. It was with some of his later films, and one of his masterpieces, The Last of England, that he would perfect his Super 8 filmmaking style. Seeing scripts as a restraint, he improvised the film and offered up what is admittedly a hard-to-understand movie, but one which delivers a much more effective experience than his previous Super 8 outings, a kaleidoscopic collage of rapidly edited and distorted footage that shows the desolation of England. Here can be seen how Jarman used the limitations of the Super 8 camera to his advantage, its lower quality and tinted footage stylizing the film, creating this depiction of England as a dystopian hellscape, the effect of which would perhaps have been diminished by higher quality footage. A dream allegory, as he has called it, that has somewhat of a framing device, opening with a shot of himself hunched over his desk, penning the poetry which will be read throughout the film, establishing him as the narrator who leads us through the film's hectic story. He uses this storytelling device to pen a venomous condemnation of Margaret Thatcher's government, drawing special attention towards rampant inequality and poverty, a major theme of the film, which as an example is expressed through these dual scenes, one of a naked man struggling to feed himself in a desolate area, which is intercut with a scene of another man supported by calipers who throws away food, showing how while the upper class wastes resources, the ones below them starve, an idea further supported by the audio track, which includes a brief snippet of a jewelry advertisement.
Picked up on that beautiful necklace, the one like I'm wearing on my neck this morning. This would make a nice set for you. 114 cubic zirconias all total.
Which is meant to invoke the idea of frivolous spending. Scenes of destroyed and burning buildings are intercut with a shot of well-dressed people walking in a more affluent-looking part of town, perhaps stockbrokers or businessmen. Again, deprivation juxtaposed with wealth. All of this destruction, desolation and deprivation is intercut with Jarman's old home movies from his childhood throughout the film, the footage being more lush with color, Jarman juxtaposing his idealized childhood with the modern England he has become disillusioned with. I'd like to remark on the editing techniques here, as they are at the heart of how Jarman conveys the film's story. Instead of using cuts to link shots and events within the same scene, he often cuts between shots that are happening in different locations with nothing connecting them save for themes, juxtaposing poverty with obscene wealth and the desolation of the present with a nostalgic past. This was a style he would return to multiple times throughout his career, such as in The Last of England's spiritual sequel, The Garden, and even some of his bigger budget scripted films where he did not shoot on 8mm still maintain a raw improvised quality to them, such as his debut, Sebastian, where he went for an almost home movie feel. And sometimes he would include Super 8 footage as well, such as in Jubilee. It was a style he had a preference for, as despite the technical limitations, he was allowed more freedom. He could have continued making more commercial movies, but not without compromising on his subject matters, a troublesome prospect for someone like himself who wanted to infuse his projects with queer themes. That and the lack of spontaneity of scripted films led him to go for what he called a peculiar sort of filmmaking. Couple this with a frustration with feature filmmaking conventions, and a reluctance to increase the scale of his projects, and you had a career trajectory that was heading in the opposite direction of a lot of other filmmakers. I can't see the creators of big-budget cinema as intelligent. The gigantism seems obsolete, the director's pretensions laughable, and also, in a world of diminishing resources, short-sighted, misplaced, and immoral. So by both choice and necessity, he was a low-budget filmmaker. Even when he was afforded money, it was minuscule compared to other filmmakers. One could also make an educated guess that he disliked the purveyors and producers of popular media, seeing them as sellouts and a part of the oppressive systems he wanted to rebel against, especially after seeing his film Jubilee, a project started by its producers as a cynical attempt at capitalizing on the growing punk movement of the 70s, but one which Jarman transformed into something else. There are similar themes to The Last of England, which he would make almost a decade later, such as the desolation of modern England, which Jarman again juxtaposes with an idealized past, but one which is symbolized by a time-traveling Queen Elizabeth I, who reacts in horror at the state her country is in. But another primary theme is of the punk movement's co-option by large media conglomerates, shown by how the film's central characters, all youth punks, one of whom is played by then up-and-coming punk musician Adam Ant, were all hired by the owner of the world's largest music company, who is portrayed like this.
This is the generation who grew up and forgot to lead their lives.
This is then expanded upon further at the end when the characters are driven to a large manor guarded by armed thugs, where they meet a suspicious-looking man claiming to be a painter. The point being made that rebellious subgenres cannot just be co-opted by pop media, but fascism as well, something Jarman felt he had prophesied when one of the stars of Jubilee, Adam Ant, appeared on the popular music TV program Top of the Pops, along with his performance at Margaret Thatcher's Falklands Ball. They all sign up one way or another, he would say. Due to not being afforded the funding of more successful filmmakers, Jarman's cinematic style was thus based on a lack of resources, and this did not just extend to the equipment he used, but also his art design as well. Though what is notable about his films is how he was able to stretch out his resources while still delivering a finished product that both looked good and interesting at the same time, adversity driving innovation. This can be seen early on in Sebastian, a project that came with all the hazards of a period film, as set dressing and costuming for stories set in the past always adds an extra cost due to the difficulties of either finding or making the historically accurate sets and costumes. Jarman solved this by filming mostly near a beach and in a derelict fort, which adds a sense of isolation to the film, while also having most of his actors either half or undressed, which saved a lot of money on costumes. Though there may have been a different reason for that choice. And I do not mean that just in the sense that Jarman wanted to put a bunch of man-ass on screen, as the copious amount of male nudity plays an important part in the main character's story, which I will explain further in a later segment. But in brief, it revolves around Saint Sebastian and takes place in 3rd century Rome, focusing on events prior to his canonization, mainly his exile by Emperor Diocletian and his conflict with his commander, who is clearly infatuated with him. And a major part of Sebastian's arc is the conflict between his Christian faith and his desire for male companionship. Hence, the choice of an isolated setting and some rather, let's say, stripped-down costume designs are meant to enhance the character's struggle by stranding him in the middle of nowhere, where he is surrounded by temptations in the form of his scantily clad fellow soldiers. His adaptation of William Shakespeare's The Tempest sees him taking a more surrealistic approach to his set design, as in his vision, the setting was supposed to be an island of the mind that opened mysteriously like Chinese boxes, and an abstract landscape so as not to distract from the poetry. Hence the film has a dreamy atmosphere, the decrepit castle in which most of the film takes place, feeling like the haunt of the mad sorcerer Prospero who inhabits it, with much of it left to rot, and many walls covered in occult script, the lighting doing much of the legwork, drenching the set in gothic ambience. In Caravaggio, he took the idea of historically anachronistic design he had first used on his work for the Devils to the next level, and made the kind of film that would give people obsessed with historical accuracy a heart attack. Characters flagrantly speak not just English, but in English accents, young Caravaggio even calling it so.
In plain English, mate, I'm an art object, and very, very expensive.
The costumes are all over the place, sometimes adhering to the film's period and sometimes violently diverging from them. And the props include things like hand calculators, magazines, an automobile and a typewriter. One possible reason for this choice was to reflect Caravaggio's own art, as although his paintings depict biblical scenes, the costumes of those in his works were contemporary to his era, though there is another explanation given by Jarman's biographer Tony Peake, who said that Jarman often used anachronisms to bring out the contemporary relevance of the past. This can be seen, for example, in this scene, where a man is typing out a scathing critique of Caravaggio's artwork, which is supposed to bring to mind the image of an unfair or slanderous critic, the likes of which Jarman may have had run-ins with. There is also the magazine, which is meant to show the rise of Caravaggio as a celebrity, Jarman equating the status of painter and his subjects to that of a filmmaker and movie stars. He went even further with this idea in Edward II, where every costume is contemporary and the set is nothing but a dungeness concrete underground, where he tried to maintain the aesthetics of a play, though the significance of this artistic choice will be explained in the next segment. Then, in Wittgenstein, he went full in on the idea of staging his films like a play, and filmed it like a live stage production, the backgrounds left black and featureless, letting the lush colors of the props and costumes pop out. This choice was inspired by the film's real-life subject, philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein's remarks on color, which were writings on the language used for colors. The way Jarman uses color in the film is also to contrast the protagonist with his environment. Wittgenstein always dressed plainly and in muted colors, while those around him are draped in every bright color on the spectrum, which is used, as Jarman biographer Michael Charlesworth explains, perpetual alienation devices. That is to say, it is meant to make Wittgenstein look like an outsider, and to reflect his struggle for both him and his philosophy to be understood.
Philosophy is just a byproduct of misunderstanding language. Why don't you realize that?
Jarman's overall philosophy on art design was to eschew the desire to dazzle the audience, and instead use it to support the film's themes. A story of exile and inhibition of desire set in a place that evokes feelings of isolation, populated with male bodies the main character is attracted to. A Shakespearean tale of magic given a dreamlike and gothic sheen by lighting and dilapidation. Period dramas that are meant to reflect modern-day issues, spruced up with anachronisms that evoke images of celebrity and social injustice. A biopic whose color choices not only reflect its real-life subject's own thoughts on colors, but also the character's alienation. One possible reason for his refusal to pick up bigger budget projects is the risk of censorship, a horrible prospect for an artist as radical as himself, and something that was sure to happen, as he was no stranger to controversy, such as when Sebastian and Jubilee were shown on Channel 4, which were cited by a British MP as examples of the kind of obscenity and filth he wanted to guard against with an amendment to a bill dubbed the Video Nasties Bill. This risk of censorship was especially abhorrent to someone like himself, who wanted to make films about gay subject matters, as his sexuality and the issues facing the queer community were often at the forefront of his art. This was something he made quite clear with his debut, Sebastian, where he made no attempt at hiding his gay themes and aesthetics, as about 80% of the film features either half-naked or fully nude men, often engaging in amorous activities, Jarman focusing quite intently in some scenes. It centers around the future Saint Sebastian, a Christian martyr, the film taking place mostly in a Roman military outpost where the soldiers spent most of their time doing stuff like this. Conflict arises when the commander tries to get Sebastian to fight, something which he refuses to do due to his religious beliefs. He is punished throughout the film for this in even more sadistic ways, slowly revealing that the conflict between the saint and his commander has less to do with the former's reluctance to fight and more due to the commander's desire for Sebastian. Thus the film is about Sebastian's temptations, as shown in this scene, where Jarman uses slow motion and an ethereal score to eroticize two naked men wrestling in a lake, which Sebastian witnesses at his commander's behest. The commander's lust for Sebastian turns then to jealousy and madness, leading to the saint's iconic attempted execution. What Jarman was trying to get across here was to punish Sebastian for rejecting his sexuality. Sebastian, the doolally Christian who refused a good fuck, gets the arrows he deserved, can one feel sorry for this Latin closet case? He did this because, as Michael Charlesworth explains, Sebastian helped usher in the Christian religion that would suppress homosexuality. Charlesworth further explains that Sebastian sublimates his patently homoerotic feelings into godly feelings, as can be seen in this scene, where after he is tied down and left to bake in the sun, he has a heat-induced hallucination where he apparently sees his lord, who he describes in a manner that is equal parts religiously exuberant and homoerotic.
Oculus formosus, oculus escaurulis, pilis heius sunt solis redi, corpus aurem est simile aure liquido.
And as the previous example illustrates, the way Jarman often explored queer themes was through historical biopics, partly because, as he explained himself, I began to read between the lines of history. The hunt was on for forebears who validated my existence, so he may have wanted to depict queerness in a historical setting for the same reason. So when he made a film about a group of Roman soldiers dicking around in a faraway outpost, he quite literally depicted them dicking around. And when he made Caravaggio, a film about the Italian painter of the same name, who is theorized to have been either gay or bisexual, Jarman made the artist's proclivities quite explicit. He did the same for his adaptation of Christopher Marlowe's play Edward II, where the rumored relationship between the English king and his favorite, Gaveston, is unambiguous. Also in his biopic of the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein, not only is the title character depicted in a relationship with a man, but so is economist John Maynard Keynes. He even had a brief shot of Jesus Christ kissing a man in the garden. And this was pretty radical, especially for someone working in the 70s and 80s, not just because of the unambiguous depiction of the character's sexuality, but also because of the unabashed display of the male nude. Though besides a desire to showcase gay figures in history, their inclusion was also a way of discussing contemporary issues. This is most evident in Edward II, a film made as a way of showing a gay love affair, Marlowe's play chosen because, as is said in Andy Kimpton Nye's 2004 documentary on Jarman, Life as Art,
the question Jarman asked himself before starting work on Edward II was, how do you get someone to commission a film about a gay love affair? Derek's answer was, find a dusty old play and violate it.
Which is to say, he changed it quite a bit, shortening the text to its most essential elements, combining characters and altering one death scene along with the ending, which I will leave unspoiled. But besides the regular alterations that are necessary for a film adaptation and set design, Jarman's most apparent change was to the play's themes, as Edward II is a protest film. Quite literally, there is a massive protest scene in the film, and the signs held by the protesters are not random, but just the kind that would have been raised in protests going on during the film's making, the giant outrage banner being the most significant, as that was the name of a gay activism group which Jarman was a part of, and the drag artists dressed as nuns are meant to be members of the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence, a satirical protest and non-profit organization who would anoint Jarman as a saint in a mock ritual. And to get an idea of what the film was supposed to be a protest of, one would need to look at the film's villains, Queen Isabella and Mortimer, who by their costumes, Isabella draped in fine dresses and jewelry, and Mortimer dressed in a military uniform, are easily pegged as representing the British establishment, who in the real world were enacting oppressive anti-gay policies, like Clause 28, which prohibited the promotion of homosexuality by local authorities, such as published materials and education, and Clause 25, which criminalized what were called gay activities, for example public indecency between men, solicitation in public, procurement of others for homosexual acts, living off a gay prostitute's salary, which were all grouped together with the indecent assault on a man. In this context, the story of Edward II changes, as it is not just about two men who are split apart and punished for their love by vindictive rivals and loved ones, but a broader metaphor for the persecution of queer people by one's family, government and religious authorities, as can be seen in the scene where Gaveston is spat upon by rows of priests. Though Jarman's oeuvre cannot just be understood as a form of protest for gay rights, as there is another element to his films, which is autobiographical. To understand much of Jarman's filmography and art as a whole, it helps to have some context into his personal life, as his work is intensely autobiographical, and Jarman himself cared little for art that lacked autobiography. I cannot watch anything that is not based on his author's life, Acting, camera work, all the paraphernalia bring me little pleasure without the element of autobiography. This is seen overtly in films such as The Last of England, where he not only cast himself as the film's storyteller, but also where he would include old family home movies from his childhood. But some films are far more subtle, such as Caravaggio, early drafts of which feature Jarman as the protagonist, an idea which he excised. But brief snippets of it still remain in the form of the voiceovers the film's titular character reads out, which were based on Jarman's own life, in particular this segment.
Now I'm counting the sheep on the hillside above our house. Pasqualone sometimes counts them with me, his hand parting my hair like the ripples at the bottom of the ocean.
According to Jarman's biographer Tony Peake, Sebastian's setting has similarities to Jarman's boarding school life, and one scene depicting essay has disturbing parallels to an incident in the director's childhood, and one could read his film about the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein as about a man's struggle to be understood, which Jarman would perhaps have identified with due to the often abstruse nature of his films.
There isn't just one picture of the world. There are lots of different language games, different forms of life, different ways of doing things with words. They don't all hang together.
What do you mean?
Though there is one film which is his most personal and vulnerable, one which differs from previous examples, as it is a film where he did not express himself through an alter ego, such as an omniscient narrator or a painter or philosopher, that film being Blue. In 1981, American scientists identified a virus that attacked the body's immune system, a virus first dubbed gay-related immunodeficiency, or GRID, by the US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, due to the erroneous belief that it was only contracted by men who had sex with other men. This became public knowledge thanks to the New York Times article titled "Rare Cancer Seen in 41 Homosexuals." This virus would later be called Acquired Immunodeficiency Syndrome, acronym AIDS. Cases would then be reported in England as well, 90% of those afflicted being gay or bisexual men. The cause of AIDS was then discovered to be a retrovirus titled Human Immunodeficiency Virus, or HIV, in 1984. Then, in December 1986, during a doctor's appointment, Jarman received the news. The young doctor who told me this morning I was a carrier of the AIDS virus was visibly distressed. I smiled and told her not to worry. I had never liked Christmas. His response was rather lax, considering that at the time of his diagnosis, there was no cure or successful treatment. As a coping mechanism, Jarman would throw himself into work and created a staggering amount of projects, including 6 feature films, several dozen shorts and music videos for such bands as The Smiths and Pet Shop Boys, and 5 published journals and autobiographies. He would also publicly announce his diagnosis, doing so in a climate where there was much fear and misunderstanding about the virus, so much so that it was considered a big deal for Princess Diana to shake hands with an AIDS patient without a glove. This was only the beginning of Jarman becoming a much more vocal activist for gay causes, as in 1990 he became a supporter of the gay rights group Outrage, who were more radical than previous organizations Jarman had been a part of, fighting against homophobia using civil disobedience. It was at this point that Jarman's art became much more outwardly political as well. I have already explained how this manifested in Edward II, a film made a year after the founding of Outrage. This could also be seen in his paintings, as during the early 90s he would produce a series of works where he took several copies of the same front page of some newspapers that had an anti-queer headline, then paint over them with violent brushstrokes, writing vitriolic texts which I presume YouTube would not allow me to read out. But as time went on, his illness worsened. Itchiness would make it impossible for him to concentrate without someone continually scratching him. He would later be diagnosed with tuberculosis of the liver. During the making of his film, The Garden, Jarman would need to view the rushes in a hospital ward, and when the film needed some reshoots, he was too ill to direct them, so other people had to handle it for him, along with the sound and music. He later contracted an AIDS-related form of pneumonia, leaving him barely able to breathe. Small white spots called molluscum contagiosum grew on his face, which would be removed with liquid nitrogen. Then, the virus would start affecting his eyesight, as toxoplasmosis, a central nervous system infection that occurs in the later stages of AIDS, would make his sight fuzzy, a condition which could lead to blindness. His vision would deteriorate further, as lesions were discovered in his retinas. It was in this state, hospital-bound much of the time, frequently too weak to work on film, and slowly losing his sight, that he set forth on making his final film, Blue. It was a project he had been developing for years, its first title being Bliss, before he changed it to International Blue in reference to its original subject, painter Yves Klein, whose most notable work was the invention of the hue known as International Klein Blue, first intended to be an experimental biography of the artist, consisting of nothing but the hue he invented, accompanied by a soundtrack that told his story through music, poetry, and dialogue. But as time passed and his health deteriorated, this idea evolved as he added a chapter about blue from his book on colors, Chroma, to the film's script, along with fractions from his diary he was writing at the time, the film's subject changing from Klein to Jarman himself. The main reason for this was his struggle to depict AIDS on camera. No 90 minutes could deal with the 80 years HIV takes to get its host. Hollywood can only sentimentalize it. It would all take place in some well-heeled West Coast beach hut. The reality would drive the audience out of the cinema, and no one viewpoint could mirror the 10,000 lives lost in San Francisco to date. So we are left with documentaries and diaries like mine, and even they cannot tell you of the constant, all-consuming nagging, of the aches and pains. How many times I've stopped to touch my inflamed face even while writing this page. There's nothing grand about it, no opera here, just the daily grind in a minor key. But in spite of that, we would wish our lives to be recorded in an oratorio by Beethoven or Mozart, not in the auction sale of Keith Haring tea towels. So he eschewed all images and depicted instead a void, the primary reason being that it gives you space for imagination by locking you into the blue. So this was a deliberate choice not done out of necessity brought on by his failing health, as this idea had first been conceived years before the worst of his symptoms. And it makes sense. What better way is there to depict declining eyesight than nothingness? What better way is there to depict oblivion except with a void? And this was also the culmination of his artistic evolution. He had always been looking to scale down his films, shooting with few crew members on small handheld cameras, distorting the image until it was close to a single color, all of his experimental work leading to Blue, his most and one of the most experimental films of all time. Though despite the simplicity of its images, to call Blue as a whole simple would be a mistake, as what lays beneath that single color is anything but. But trying to capture the experience of watching Blue in writing is a tricky proposition, as much of the experience is atmospheric and meditative. Its suggested imagery often abstract and poetic, the film as a whole needing to be seen to get a true grasp of what Jarman intended. It can be easily split into three different kinds of segments that flow seemingly at random into one another. First would be the contemporary segments, consisting of Jarman's diary entries that recount his struggles with illness, hospital visits, and the health complications brought on by his treatments. These parts give the film its structure, as he recounts therein his deteriorating health, his condition worsening with each entry, beginning with what at first sounds like an amusing anecdote of him putting his clothes on backwards before getting almost hit by a cyclist, a scene which gains ominous subtext when you realize that this was caused by the first onset of blindness. What follows after that are a series of doctor's appointments, his eyesight getting worse with each one, the inevitability of death and blindness growing ever clearer. The second kind of segment are the retrospective ones, where Jarman recounts happier times, such as his interactions with an out lesbian he had met in his youth, who had acted as an inspirational figure to him during a time when he feared his sexuality, or his poetic description of a rave or discotheque of a kind he was no longer capable of partaking in. These tend to be more light-hearted and nostalgic than the rest of the film, offering a welcome reprieve. Then finally, there are the more abstract poetic segments, which are harder to get your head around than the rest of the film. Some are quite straightforward, such as one poem about him wanting to kiss his lover and the fleeting joy it provides. But then there are others, such as this bit of prose in which Blue is presented as a character on a journey of its own, which are more difficult to interpret. Though what these kinds of segments provide is not only some of the film's best imagery, but also its most emotionally resonant moments, my favorite one being the final scene, which is a poem about two men fishing for pearls in the ocean, the text suggesting a romantic connection, the poem as a whole being about the inevitable death and destruction of all things, which acts as both a mournful but beautiful end for the film. All of this is then supported by the gorgeous music of composer Simon Fisher Turner, which gives the film a range of atmospheres, be it ethereal, mysterious, forlorn, or joyous. And even though there is just a single image throughout, there is a lot of suggested imagery invoked by the sound design, which helps bring you into the film's world. All of these parts come together into a one-of-a-kind film, which, for its short runtime, explores and evokes a plethora of topics and feelings, but is overall about its creator's struggle with illness and acceptance of death. It is not necessarily an easy watch, and the prospect of staring at a single color for over an hour is not that appealing, but in the right mood and right setting, and if given time and patience, the experience of watching Blue is unlike any other. Despite the years of therapy, Derek Jarman would die 5 months after the release of his final film, leaving a rich body of works, which has its admirers, but is nonetheless unknown by most people, and that would probably never have bothered him. He was not an artist with desires to cater to popular interests, and always sought after experimentation that would alienate most audiences. Yet knowledge of him and his work is still worth spreading, so I would like to close this video off with a little guide for those interested. First of all, when it comes to his films, a good start would be Jubilee, as it is his most fun movie, and one which would act as a good primer for his other works. From there, Caravaggio would be a good follow-up, as it is more coherent than most of his films, and is very important for his oeuvre, as it was the first time he worked with frequent collaborators like Nigel Terry, Tilda Swinton, and Sean Bean, and it is also Tilda Swinton's debut film, and perhaps, spoilers, the first film where Sean Bean's character gets killed off. From there you can go with any of these 5, Sebastian, The Tempest, War Requiem, Edward II, and Wittgenstein, and from there you can go with his more experimental work, Last of England being a good start, then The Garden, and maybe Angelic Conversation, though even I had trouble with that one. But of course, even if you skip on all of these, I would implore anyone to at least try to watch Blue. Then for written material, I have 2 biographies, starting with Michael Charlesworth's book on him for the Critical Life series, which is short and concise. But if you want a much broader exploration of the man, then Tony Peake's book on him is a must-read. Though for those who want to go to the primary source, then Jarman wrote and published 4 journals, Dancing Ledge, Modern Nature, Smiling in Slow Motion, and Kicking the Pricks, all of which are required reading for any Jarman fan, along with one of his best books, At Your Own Risk, which is a sort of manifesto/autobiography where he gives several anecdotes and criticisms of the British government, all covering queer issues. With that done, I would like to thank you for watching. If you made it to the end of this video, then maybe consider liking and subscribing for more content like this.